gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this event. My name is Jean Andre, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo. Many of you call me Dean Jean, which I kind of like, I'll be honest. I have been the Dean for the last 6 years. I've been a professor at the university for more than 30 years, and I have my PhD from the University of Waterloo. And so like many of you, I'm an alum. I want to begin today with a land acknowledgement. The University of Waterloo, and in fact, my home, are on the Haldeman Tract, which is the land 6 miles on either side of the Grand River. This is the traditional territory of the Neutral, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. And we make these land acknowledgements to remind us about the importance of understanding our shared histories and of addressing the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I also want to acknowledge what unusual times we live in. I suspect that none of us could have imagined 35 weeks ago that we would be in a global pandemic where all of our norms, all of the ways in which we came to think of as normal have been turned over. But I know that we're in this together. The world, in fact, is in this together, and that we'll respond in a way that we'll all come out the other side. I'm really delighted that so many of you have decided to join us today. We're really pleased to put this event on, and I know that we're joined by many alum of both our faculty and of course from other faculties, and by guests and other interested people. We're happy to share our thinking with you. As many of you know, the Faculty of Environment has the largest planning school in the country, and because of this, we do a lot of thinking about cities. And of course, it isn't just the School of Planning, it's the entire faculty and many other departments as well. And so we put together this panel to share some of our thinking, and of course, to have you share some of your thinking about cities in the age of COVID. Many years ago, many of you will remember that Jane Jacobs talked about the death of the North American city. There are other pundits who early in the pandemic wondered about whether or not cities too would die. But I think we know that cities are here to stay, but they will change, and that's part of what we're going to discuss today. So before I introduce our main speaker, our MC, I want to first remind you that we have a chat box, and that you could open it up and you can insert your questions, and that we have a moderator who will be examining those and feeding those to Dr. Pierre Filion as can happen. So you can fill those in as we go. I also want to remind you to please put your microphones and cameras off. And then with no further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Pierre Filion, my colleague, a friend, and a faculty member of the University of Waterloo for 35 years, which is incredible. Started his career in 1985. Pierre did his formal education primarily in Quebec and then in the UK. He did his CEGEP in social sciences and literature, and then a bachelor in journalism and political science. And those of you who've heard Pierre on the radio and seen him in other media will understand that he has an affinity for journalism, not just through his studies, but in the way he interacts with the public. His master's is in political science, both his undergrad and master's from Laval. And then he did his PhD in urban studies at the University of Kent. He joined us, as I say, in 1985, and he established himself within the North American and the world community as an expert on Canadian cities, on how cities grow generally, on density, on intensification, on inner cities. He's known, I know, for many things, but his book on the Canadian cities in transition is one really major contribution that he has made time and time again. Those of you who are in the academic world will be impressed with his H index. For those of you who aren't, I won't bother you with that, except to say that people read his work and they think about what he has to say. He's a supreme educator, and as I've noted, he's media friendly and in fact, always engaged in the broader community. So with no further ado, Pierre, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jean. I just want to say how lucky we are at the Faculty of the Environment to have Jean as a dean. Not only is she managing the faculty in these difficult times, but she's launching all kind of initiatives while doing that at the same time. And some of these initiatives have to do with COVID and reflections on COVID. And this is an event that has to do with that. It has to do with COVID and the city. Through my career, I've always referred to the kind of cities I was looking at as the post-war city. It had evolved, it had changed, but the fundamental dimensions of the North American urban environment was set after the Second World War. Now I'm wondering if we're going to talk about the post-pandemic city. We don't know yet because we're in a period of uncertainty. Uncertainty, I mean, the science evolves, the pandemic itself evolves in an unpredictable way. The way people react to the pandemic also evolves in an unexpected way. And I think in these times, it is very important to listen to experts. Not that experts know everything, but they're the people who know the most in those difficult circumstances and uncertain circumstances. And this is what we're going to do this late morning and early afternoon. So the way we're going to proceed is as follows. Each panelist will give a 5-minute presentation on an area of on their expertise. And this will be followed by a 7-minute question and answer, fielding questions from the audience, and I will allow myself to ask questions as well. Maybe other panelists will ask questions at that level. Incidentally, for the audience, when you ask a question, if it was possible to identify where you're where you're writing from, where you're asking your question from. And then after each presentation and each question period that will focus on an individual presentation, we will have an about 30-minute audience question and answer. I will now introduce the panelists. Juan Moreno Cruz. Juan is an economist, and he will help us understand how cities can turn crisis into opportunity. He will also consider the social inequality that the pandemic has brought about. The pandemic hasn't affected everyone in the same way. Some people are affected more, some people are able to shield themselves. So this is something Juan will discuss. Juan is a Canada Research Chair and a researcher in the School of the Environment, Enterprise, and Development. And his presentation will be, as I said, social equity, inequality, and segregation, access to public good, and innovation policy. Another speaker will be Heather Hall. Heather will help us understand the dynamic between cities and the surrounding areas, focusing more on the rural environment and small town environment. And she's an expert in economic development in rural Canada and a researcher in the School of Environment, Enterprise, and Development. So the presentation will deal with relationship between rural and urban areas, socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19, intensification of relationship like supply chains and agriculture, and the future of work. Third speaker, Isaac Amwangi. So Isaac will be talking to us from Nairobi, and he's an alumnus of the faculty, and he's an alumnus of the School of Planning. And he's teaching at the moment at the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Nairobi. So Isaac will share takes on what policy works and what doesn't work, and what to expect next for cities in Africa, which is the most rapidly urbanizing place in the earth. And it is also a place that has seemed to manage the best. It's among the places that manage the best with the pandemic. So he will talk about urbanization in East Africa, housing gaps, informal settlements, responses and challenges of COVID-19 and policy implications. The first presenter is Sheila Butting. So Sheila will help us understand how COVID-19 is transforming real estate, which is a powerful force in urbanization. And Sheila is the principal and president of Young. She is really a sommity in terms of the real estate community in Canada. She has worked extensively with municipal planners, architects, and developers to envision and create new communities and places that deliver sustainable, healthy communities and financial feasibility. So she will talk about downtown office spaces, and I'm really looking forward to what she's going to say because this is one of my areas of research. She will look into the future of work and technology, footprint optimization, and change management. Before starting, I would like to ask each presenter just to say a few words how they are personally affected by the pandemic and how they're reacting to the pandemic. So Sheila, looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Great. Thanks so much, Pierre. It's been a real pleasure to be able to speak with everyone today. So you've asked me to say, how am I doing with the pandemic? And to be honest, it's been fairly positive. I enjoy working remotely. I miss going downtown to the city every day, but I very much enjoy kind of the work-life balance of being able to go for a walk and enjoy my family every day. So for me personally, there's been no hardship. Unlike my aging parents and some of my children who, of course, suffer from either not being able to work full time, or my parents who are 90 years old and have to be housebound. So I think it really affects everybody differently in our society. As you talked about it, I'm going to share my screen and talk to everybody about cities in the future, but with a real focus on the future of work and where we're going with the workplace. I spend a lot of time talking about this with various audiences. I'm probably speaking, 10, 15 times a week. Everybody's quite riveted to this conversation. So if you think about the future of work, it's within the context of our increasingly urban environment or in fact, national environment. There's many different factors that are affecting the economy, the environment, the population. The key factors that workplace and employers are riveted on, of course, economics and geopolitics and finance and, diversity and inclusion. But the biggies right now that I'll speak to are demographics, climate, health and wellness, and technology as they affect the workplace. One of the things that we've found out about is that the working population, if you think about it, has multiple generations. There's 5 different generations in the workforce, from veterans and boomers through to millennials, Gen Z, and Gen X's. And really the opportunity for employers is to bring all these generations together. In a COVID environment, really difficult to do. And so we're all doing it by Zoom or Teams or some other opportunity. What we've learned is that the demographics in terms of the population, by 2036, there's only going to be 2.3 workers to every senior. And so therefore, the boomers today have a large presence in the workplace and most importantly in the decision-making process. What should the office look like? And what should the workplace of the future look like? On top of that, we have a multi-generational and diverse ethnic population also in the workplace. You can see that the average Canadian population, 40% of it is either first or second generation Canadian. And so that also has implications for our workplace. We have activism that's taking place, whether it's for the environment or social diversity, all of those other topics. And then we had COVID, right? And COVID completely heightens all of those urban challenges. And in some cases, accelerates the transformation. So there's two aspects of COVID that's going on that is really influencing the workplace and how and where people work. If you think about the cities and the real estate asset classes, virtually every single asset class has been affected. In the office world, people can work anywhere, anytime. Technology with our laptops and our mobile devices allow us to be very agile. In retail, you can shop anywhere, anytime. So the store networks are in a major shift, as are the shopping malls and neighborhood centers. In the industrial asset class, it's exploding now because all of our stuff that we're buying that arrives to our doors every day is in the industrial asset class. And the public sector too is also changing. Suddenly courtrooms have to go online. Colleges and universities, as you know, have classes online, and schools are challenged. Every aspect of our society, the traditional way that we've done things, is changing, affecting the urban environment. And then you end up in the high density areas of downtown versus the suburban markets. And there's a huge conversation about downtown suburban versus rural markets. What we do know is that everybody's asking, is the office dead? And so absolutely, the office is not dead. COVID-19 radically shakes up the workplace and how we do business. And in fact, it's the largest change management activity around the globe because it's really accelerated the organizational change and the war for talent with the balance between working from home or working from the office. It really is forcing employers to say, what is the role of the office? For employees before COVID, 82% of them said they wanted to have the opportunity to be flexible, to be able to work from home 1, 2, 3 days a week and the balance in the office. For employers, they're now saying, what is the value proposition to our employees in the war for talent? So hence, all of my days are spent looking at this dynamic, which is really what is the relationship, the physical relationship that people have, whether it's a physical interaction or a virtual interaction. For the employer, they can have their offices either downtown or in the suburban, so that becomes the physical location versus the distributed workforce. And we're all distributed today, where folks will be working from home. You can work, onshore, nearshore, offshore, whatever that happens to be, or AI or robotics, the technology that's changing that. And so really the number one question today is how do we address footprint optimization? That's really what employers are looking to. What we do know is that the traditional workplace, otherwise known as the cube farm, may very well be dead. That's my personal view. These office designs, and you could pick anywhere, any city in North America, and you would see this kind of a design where all the big egos are around the outside, the worker bees are on the inside, all about the individual and not about collaboration or teaming. And when we did the bums and seats analysis, when you actually sorted through, is anybody actually sitting at their seat, the average office was 50% vacant. As a result, most large corporate occupiers are reducing their footprint. Instead of the old school 200 square feet per employee, now they're coming to agile work environments that can achieve 90 to 100 square feet employee in these new worlds. In the middle of COVID, one would think that, everybody's getting rid of their office space because they may not need that much. Whereas in fact, we're seeing the vacancy rates today are largely stable. People are saying we're not going to rush to a decision. We're going to, be cautious. What employers are doing is that they're releasing any surplus space that they have into the market. So we call it the sublet vacancy rate, and that is very slowly increasing. That was by second quarter of 2020, and we expect this trend to improve. In the design of the office space, going back to my conversation about traditional offices, we would say that it's the death of dull. And it's all about creating the creative circle and making sure that employees have a reason to go to the office. For the employees, you would say, why would you bother going to work? Well, workplaces, like cities, are all about the hub of innovation. Its power is about the mix of people, cultural, and ideas. And so therefore, the human experience becomes everything in workplace. What we also know is that spaces restrict creativity. Toddlers and young children are 92% more creative and innovative than anybody over 30 through all the studies that have been done. It's shocking. What architects have done is they've recognized that as soon as you build traditional environments, such as the picture on the right there on the schools and exam rooms, that really helps to restrict creativity. So there's been a movement toward more creative workplaces. But what we do know is that one size does not fit all in the innovative workplace of the future. And so while some folks would embrace the traditional environment, many more are moving toward a digital optimization environment with agile workplaces. So people don't have assigned seating, they move and they use data in a way that they see fit. Sometimes in the COVID environment, that is effective because, of course, tricky to engage in that relationship with masks and so on. Workplaces in our COVID world are trying to balance the innovation, the dynamic workplace design, while at the same time, focusing on health and wellness, often using smart workplace technologies like mobile devices to be able to test your wellness at a given point in time, and also, of course, embracing diversity and inclusion. Back to my topic earlier about how our Canadian working population is increasingly diverse. What we do know is that organizations, and of course cities, that understand the human experience in their workplace, they can gain a competitive advantage overall. And so, Pierre, that's my short presentation. I welcome any questions that you may have to ask.
Okay. As MC, I think I have the privilege to ask the first question, and also have the privilege. Thank you for that great presentation and very enlightening. One thing, if I were to ask myself the question, how do I react to the pandemic? One thing I'm missing as a result of the pandemic is going downtown Toronto. This is something I like doing. And when I go downtown Toronto, I would have my favorite places in food courts and the financial district that are really good, and ethnic food and so on, where I would go. Now, the question I'm putting to you is that with the changes in the workplace, let's say, under all the different scenarios, let's say people go to work twice a week instead of 5 days a week. And that makes it so that you have 50% of the pre-COVID worker population in downtown Toronto and the post-COVID or the post-pandemic population downtown Toronto. What effect would that have for the ecosystem of restaurants, shops, and so on that exists in downtown Toronto? And wouldn't there be a risk there that it would create a chain effect, whereby there would be less reasons for living in downtown Toronto, there would be less reasons for going downtown Toronto, and so on, that would cause a decentralization of activities, more towards neighborhoods, more towards residential areas?
So I think you're absolutely right. It's like somebody took all the cards, threw them up in the air, and they said, where are they going to land? So predicting where they're going to land is really tough. What I would tell you is that pre-COVID, people were already working in agile ways, and employers were already moving toward flexibility to allow their employees to work from home 1 or 2 days a week. So that trend was already taken place. Now we have COVID, we're largely still in lockdown, although trying to ease up, and it will take a time to get back to new normal, whatever we define as new normal. I think that employers will increasingly adjust their workplaces. Their individual workplaces were empty 50% of the time. By empty, I mean people aren't sitting at their seats. They're downstairs to Starbucks, they're in restaurants. Will it take time to get back to that? Absolutely. Is there a role for a downtown? Absolutely. Because back to your point, by nature, we want to collaborate with other people. We need to innovate. So, back to my maturity curve, one size does not fit all. And I think that we will go back, whatever go back comes to in terms of the definition. The underground in Toronto and the retail shopping experience may take longer to go back. And it's tragic for the small and independent businesses that would be part of the path network. And that's any major city, around the globe. It's not just Toronto.
Are there questions from the other panelists?
Hi, Pierre. Sheila, I'm just wondering, I know that a lot of the innovation research stresses the importance of interaction between stakeholders in the innovation ecosystem, or whatever term you use. And that interaction is really built on trust. So do you feel that going forward, if we do see people working more remotely long term, that this is going to undermine our innovation ecosystem here in Canada and in cities across the country?
Yeah, absolutely not. So I think by nature, we want to get together with other people, but I think we have to be more prescriptive on how we get together with the other people. So if I choose to work from home, on Fridays and I Zoom into a meeting where other folks are in the room, I'm quickly going to realize I should be in that room, right? And so I think that it's going to come back to a level of balance and how people get things done. It's just almost the same conversation about the underground in Toronto, right? It's the same thing. We'll get back to that because our basic DNA craves proximity for other people, for innovation, for intellectual challenge.
Thank you.
Are there other questions from the panelists?
I do have a question, and this is not directly to what you talked about, seeing it maybe in your experience you have learned something about the previous pandemics have brought different power structures between employers and employees. The great example of the Black Death that freed people from their land and to move to cities. And every pandemic has like this rejuggling of the power struggle between employees and employers. And I wonder if the people that you have talked to, or even if your own experience, if you see something like that moving forward, in that sense that if workers now can work remotely, they have more power and to where to work and how to work. If you see that translated into, for example, ownership of the firms relative to what we had before.
Yeah. So I think it's too early to be able to say that specifically. What I would say is that all employers are focused on the war for talent. And that's about highly capable, diverse talent to be able to deliver their product, their business, their profitability. And so when I talked about, the aging workforce, well, that young talent, the employees, are really what it's all about in the future. And so in Canada, the employers really want that. In terms of the inequities, I think that highly skilled, highly talented employees are in high demand. I think that perhaps those that may fall behind are those that don't have the training and the skill sets and the capabilities. And so that gap, that's your area of research more so than mine, but that would be where the gap would come into play.
Other questions from the panelists? If not, I have a last question. There again, I have a lot of privileges as DMC. Sheila, everyone I know involved in real estate is an optimist. Sees the world, in a positive way. Do you have moments where you think about how things could go wrong? And when you think about that, what vision would you have, or, what is it, that could really not work after the pandemic? Would it be because, governments at that point would have incurred too much debt, and then we would have to deal with that? That would have a drawing effect on the economy, or some other factors that would come into play.
So in the real estate world, my job is to solve problems, right? I'm a strategy thinker. I solve problems. I do that. The thing that concerns me most about Canada is our competitiveness globally. I think that incurring too much debt, burdening the businesses and population with too much in the way of taxes to pay for that debt is a major issue, and that affects our competitive advantage. So I'm very worried about that. Population could just shrug and say, why bother? And so that's what keeps me awake at night and what I'm passionate about.
Okay, thank you very much. I will start by asking the first question, which is how have you been affected and how have you reacted to the pandemic? Then Yuan will talk about pandemic inequality and inequity in the North American context.
Thank you. Thank you, Pierre. And thank you, Sheila, for your previous presentation. I truly learned a lot. I'm not familiar with that area, so thank you. To answer your question, like Sheila, I think I have been very fortunate. I don't, and I'll be talking about this. I haven't faced the heavy burdens of the pandemic. I had two daughters, and when schools closed, I became a homeschool teacher, which is not what I'm trying to do, not good at either. That was intense, and it made me think of how many other families actually have even the privilege to teach their kids in these situations. It has been a weird time. I have been very reflective of my luck as a Colombian moving to Canada and experiencing pandemic in a job that is so secure as the one that I have. So I understand my privilege when I see the perspective of how COVID could have affected people other than me. And that is really what I'm going to talk about today. So let me share my screen. And we can get going. So this picture is an aerial photograph of two neighborhoods in Detroit, Jefferson Chalmers and Grosse Pointe Park. It's very stark difference you can see when you are flying over these neighborhoods. And you can see that just divided by a canal, there is a neighborhood that is poor and there is a neighborhood that is wealthy. Actually, in the poor neighborhood, Jefferson Chalmers, the average house price is a little less than $100,000. The houses in Grosse Pointe Park are around 500 on average, 500,000. And it's just divided by a single canal. If you go to Google and try to do this far away, it's quite dramatic. And it's true in many of our cities. And this is what Martin Luther King was saying in that rich neighborhood several decades ago. He was saying every city in our country has this kind of dualism, this schizophrenia, that is split in many parts. And so every city ends up being two cities rather than one. And this is my starting point. I want to talk to you about the fact that our experiences with COVID depend on whether in which city we live within the city. So to understand what I mean by this, I want you to look at Chicago in 1980 and Chicago in 2010. The dark blue in these maps are areas where the majority of people are rich, and the yellow areas are the ones where the majority of people are poor. And what we can see is that over time, people that can have started to segregate. So this is what I call segregation by income. Yeah. So we see a lot more people just living among themselves. And this has problems, real problems for the economy, for society, and of course, for how we play out this pandemic. This great difference in opportunity. So when you are surrounded by people with connections and with money, you are more likely to have connections and money. And this translates into your long-time income. So there was this experiment in Seattle that people were offered vouchers to move from poor neighborhoods to afford rich neighborhoods. That move increased their income by around $250,000 in their lifetime, which is a lot compared around 10 years more of income. And there's also difference in opportunity in the sense that people from rich neighborhoods are more likely to file for a patent, a lot more likely, 10 times more likely to file for a patent than people from poor neighborhoods. And the differences are so stark in that actually, you can see it in life expectancy. In Chicago, one of the richest neighborhoods, Streeter Bile, has an life expectancy that is 30 years more than one of the poorest neighborhoods in Chicago. And the difference is starking. The houses in Streeterville go for around $500,000. The houses in the poor neighborhood of Englewood go for 1/10 of that price, around $50,000. And the reason I mention prices is because that's how I, as an economist, think of how all the amenities and all the things related to your place of living are materialized into a value. So our cities have become more unequal and more segregated. And I think about the impacts of COVID by looking at two cities within one. The New York Times produced a series of articles about how the pandemic played out in New York. So let me start with New York then. I want you to look at these figures and think of who and where do you fit in here. I know maybe I'm not top 1, but I'm definitely top 5%. And there are a bunch of people, the majority, that have a very different reality. So in the figure to the left, you see the amount of people that were able to leave home and when they left home as soon as the pandemic broke. And what we see is that rich people, top 1%, top 5%, left earlier than anybody else. And as soon as school closed, most of them that were going to leave left. Around 30% to 35% of people left. But the important thing here is that not everybody had access to that possibility. Nobody has a house on the outskirts of New York that they can actually travel to. The majority of people actually stayed home, and they stayed home after school closure. So there are very important implications about this. There are people that stay home because they couldn't work away from their place of employment. So people that we call essential workers had to stay working. And essential workers actually are poor people. So they have to keep working, they have to keep going to the office, but now they have their kids at home. So two things happen. The kids are no longer being taught anything. I was able to do it. The kids of the essential workers were not able to do this. Or they are sent to live with their parents, of course. Their parents are also poor, or grandparents, sorry, and they're also poor and at risk. So this divergence between rich and poor within the city creates problems in terms of how the pandemic plays out. And who lives, this is going to come as no surprise to anybody. White rich people are the ones living. So how does this play out in terms of outcomes is, especially in a pandemic, is important. So this is New York. And what we can see is that in this map is that where people were able to live is where fewer people died. And we see that people that in very high poverty, with very high poverty characteristics, actually died more than rich people. And that Black Americans and Hispanics are also more likely to die of COVID than white people. So this segregation at the city level actually can be seen in health outcomes. This is the US, this is not Canada, this is Toronto. And Toronto has the same trends. Poor people that we see now are more likely to get COVID and also more likely to die from COVID. And also, as a proportion, Black people, Arab, Middle Eastern, Latin American people, Southeast Asian people are also more likely than their representation, their share to get COVID. So what do we do with this? We live in a world where cities are divided in two, the rich cities and the poor cities. And the reason they're divided in two is because they're designed that way. Yeah. Rich people need poor people to do service work for them. And we need to recognize that, and we all not want to hear it. But when I say that my experience in the pandemic has been good, it has been good because there are a lot of people that actually kept working to make my experience good. I get my groceries delivered to me. I actually get beer delivered to me. I have been living pretty much the same life that I used to live before, because there are people that now are facing more risk by working. And I think we often forget about that, but we shouldn't. And if we want to do something moving forward, then we need to think hard about how we make two cities into one. And I have some ideas. Of course, these are large and difficult to implement. But the first thing that we need to do is to improve access to health. And this means create redundancy. We have been moving in a direction in which in the name of efficiency and to reduce the size of government, we have been closing access to actually healthcare. And that is problematic. Redundancy is important. It needs to exist so that everybody, rich and poor, can have access to it. Yeah. So, and redundancy and efficiency not often go together, except in situations like this. So we need to understand if, due to climate change or increased poverty, we are going to find globalization, we're going to be seeing a lot more pandemics in the cities. Then we need to be prepared for this. The first step is then to improve access to healthcare. The other thing that we can do is to start to remove those socioeconomic barriers that keep people apart. We need to allow the poor segment of our population to have access to the same opportunities as rich people do. And to do that, we need to create better affordable housing programs, including housing search assistance. The Seattle experiment, the main implication they come out is that it's not only that you give vouchers, it's that you tell them how to use them. I don't know where to look for a house. So we need to actually invest in these services to allow people to move to opportunity. The other thing that we need to do is to create an improved affordable college education, even free college. And the reason for this is that poor people have a debt to income ratio that reaches around 80% because of college education. Yeah. So we need to reduce that burden, because then that way people can afford housing, can afford moving. But if you are tied to your debt, then you don't get the choices that people that are not tied to their debt have. We need to improve accessibility to good jobs. One of the things that we know about the pandemic is that the more we shop online, the more we work online, the service jobs that were in the cities are going to disappear. I don't need waitresses and waiters. I don't need people to provide those services around the working environment anymore. So we need to think about what is going to happen to them once we start to move away from downtown. And for that, we need to move actual people, maybe improve transportation, public transportation, but we also need to move companies. We need to actually try to move the people work at places towards where the people are. And finally, bring down barriers. And this, I mean, literally, cities are built in a way that segregate. We don't have enough access across neighborhoods, and we need to be aware of that and build bridges and bring down barriers is the way I would like to close. So thank you for having me, and I'm open for questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Joan. I've been told to limit it to one question. And as I'm DMC, I'm the one who's going to ask that question. That's okay. Yuan, you showed that map of Toronto with the number of cases concentrated in the northeastern part of Toronto. Now, the most recent of those maps shows that the highest concentration of cases is on the waterfront. So I'll put the following question to you, is that it seems to me like the pandemic has happened in waves. First waves, it was people weren't aware of the pandemic, travelers who carried the virus and brought it to different places. Or they were aware, but there was nothing they could do about it. I mean, they were in midst of traveling and they were the vectors. The second phase was people who could not shelter, largely because of work, partly because they were institutionalized, partly because they lived in multi-generational households. They weren't able to isolate themselves, and they're the ones who were affected. Now I think we're in the third wave, where you have people who are affected because they don't care. You know, they keep on going out, they're doing things, they tend to be younger people. That is going to have an effect because the virus spreads. Can you talk about the effect of that third wave could have on the people who cannot shelter themselves?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. It opens the opportunity to tell you what I believe about our policy response. I think the way we respond to COVID is common to the way we have responded to previous pandemics, and it's income-based. By that I mean, if a pandemic affects, the initial signs of the pandemic is that wealthy people or everybody are equally affected, then we respond by closing everything and we are very careful. But as soon as we learn more that some section of the population is not going to be affected, we change our policy prescriptions and we are okay opening the economy. Why? Because we, as wealthy Canadians, are not affected by it. So the idea that the third wave comes in is not independent from the fact that we learned earlier on that a fraction of the population, one of our two cities within the city, is not being affected at the same rate. So we send people back to work, we open restaurants, we open the economy, and they're being affected. And we are telling people, you can go to bars. So they go to bars, and we can open restaurants. Why? Because the restaurant economy is strong, it's important. We need a good base to maintain the economy going. So we send people to keep the economy going. So I think it's not that they don't care. I think it's that our policy response have put people at risk because we can isolate ourselves from the risk that those people are facing. And like you said, now we have more people at risk and we have a second wave coming in.
Thank you very much, Ivan. The next speaker is Heather Hall. And just to remind you, Heather will talk about rural areas and small towns, how they are affected. And I'm asking Heather the same question as well. How are you personally affected by the pandemic?
Thank you, Pierre. COVID-19, I think, has impacted every facet of my life. I do feel like Juan, very lucky and privileged to still have a job and to work during this time. And the nature of the research that I do has actually brought, I think, more opportunity for my work. But like many parents across the country, I'm balancing childcare with a child who just turned 2 and work. I'm adapting to online teaching for the first time, and I'm trying to support the students in the program that I'm the director of through a very uncertain time. Added to that, my partner is also a frontline worker. So that adds an additional element of fear for his health and safety every time he goes to work. In terms of my presentation, as Pierre mentioned in the introduction, I'm here to talk to you about rural communities. And I've had the opportunity to live and work in rural northern communities across the country, from Newfoundland and Labrador to Saskatchewan and the Yukon. And since April, I have been working with the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation to understand the impacts of COVID-19 on rural communities and the responses needed for recovery. Some of you might be thinking, why is there someone talking about rural communities on a Cities in the Age of COVID-19 panel? And that's a great question. The short answer is that rural communities and cities are interconnected in many ways, and I think this relationship has really intensified and become more apparent as a result of COVID-19. Before discussing that relationship in a little bit more detail, I'd like to discuss some of the unique impacts of COVID-19 on rural communities, largely in Canada. My intent is not to lessen the impacts of COVID-19 on cities, but to broaden our understanding of the impacts of COVID-19 on places big and small. Since March, people in rural communities across Canada have struggled with unemployment, uncertainty, fear, and competing demands over work and providing childcare and family care, which is not unlike the experiences of people living in cities. However, the impacts of COVID-19 are really deepened in rural communities because of their unique socioeconomic context. Rural communities often have smaller populations, which means they have a limited workforce and a smaller tax base to be able to respond to challenges like COVID-19. There are also larger distances to markets, services, and healthcare. Economic activities in rural communities often tend to be seasonal, like agriculture, fishing, and tourism. And there's a reliance on a smaller number of industries and sectors. This means that the closure of even one business in a small rural community can have a huge ripple effect through the entire socioeconomic fabric of that community. When it comes to healthcare, some rural communities have hospitals, but many have health centers or nursing stations with limited or no infrastructure to care for critically ill patients. Many of our rural health systems were already stretched before COVID-19 due to a persistent shortage of doctors and specialists, as well as aging populations and higher incidences of complex and chronic illnesses. Any added stress on the rural healthcare system could potentially devastate some communities. And finally, as many of the social and economic aspects of our daily lives have been pushed online to manage the risks of COVID-19, I think one of the biggest impacts on people in rural Canada has been access to broadband. We have rural communities where students cannot connect to virtual learning, where employees cannot work from home, where people cannot connect to virtual medicine, and where businesses cannot transition to online sales simply because there is limited or no access to broadband. This is not a new issue for rural Canada, but COVID-19 has certainly shone a huge spotlight on the digital divide that exists in this country and in many others. So why should we think about rural when we think about cities? Our rural communities often depend on our cities for access to both basic and specialized healthcare, as well as services like retail and education, and for employment opportunities. Cities, on the other hand, depend on industries like fishing, tourism, forestry, mining, agriculture, and food processing, many of which are located in rural and remote communities, and many were deemed essential to maintain supply chains and access to food and other products that are seen as vital to our economies and our livelihoods. And finally, many people from cities have been escaping to rural during this pandemic to access rural assets like affordability, space, and natural amenities. While this interest in rural has brought opportunities, it has also created a lot of tensions, from fear of the virus being introduced into rural communities to conflicts with seasonal residents, as well as overcrowding at beaches and other rural amenities, and some tourists ignoring both local and provincial health orders. We also need to have important conversations around who in the city has the ability or the means to escape to rural and who does not. Over the last several months, rural communities have responded to the impacts of COVID-19 in a number of ways, from travel bans and bubbles and closing rural attractions to creating buy local campaigns, promoting stay home year and staycations, assisting mom and pop shops transition to online sales where possible and curbside pickup, as well as retooling businesses to help fill gaps in our supply chains. However, what we need are immediate, medium, and long-term place-based plans, programs, policies, and investments to support relief and recovery. I strongly believe we are at a crossroads. We can use COVID-19 as an opportunity to forge a new path that invests in long-term resilience, or we can let COVID-19 deepen the inequalities that exist across Canada and around the world between people and places. Thank you for joining us this morning and for listening to my discussion. If you're interested in rural Canada and COVID-19, please visit the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation.
Okay, thank you very much, Heather. There is a question or comment from the audience that really appreciates the fact that you're talking about connectivity within rural areas, and says that, and it's from the UK, and it says that it counters the misinformation peddled by multinationals and their so-called smart city products and services. So I would like you, if you want to comment about the bias between the attention that is given to the smart city concept that is presented as an urban concept and the needs that exist in urban areas and small towns as well.
Certainly, one of the things we've been advocating here before even the pandemic, but we've intensified our calls for, is to apply what's called a rural lens. So whenever we're thinking about different programs, plans, policies, is to think about it in the context of rural. And so if we think about concepts like smart cities, ensuring that we're also thinking about how rural communities play a role. And there's rural communities here in Canada that have certainly been part of the smart city moniker, even though they wouldn't be classified as a city. So I think anytime we can promote having that lens and trying to understand perhaps the differences between rural and urban, but also where they're interconnected, and coming up with ways to be more inclusive in our policy.
Okay, thank you very much, Heather. The next and last speaker is Isaac Mwangi, and he will be talking about urbanization in Africa, the housing gaps, and also all of this in the context of the pandemic. Isaac?
Yeah, thank you very much, moderator. Thank you much, panelists. You can put up my presentation as you agreed. As I begin my presentation, the question, how have weather dominant during COVID? I would like to say that it has been very difficult initially, because as a head of a department in the university, I had to lead my faculty in being trained for online teaching students as well, and it has been quite heavy. Also, the second most challenging thing is that I had to work from home. Right from where I'm talking from I have an office in the house. So when the university closed, everybody has to work from home, and it has not been very easy. Usually, I have worked more. I've realized that working from home, especially if you are a leader of a faculty or a unit in a company, you may have to work more because of advising and also leading others and so forth. So I've tended to work more. Now, on my presentation, just trying to generate some discussion points from Eastern Africa. You can go to the next slide. Now, those are my 6 points of discussion. As I clear from there: warning on COVID, urbanization in East Africa, pre-COVID urbanization context and intervention in Kenya, just as to illustrate, and then indicators for the future based on 2019 census. We had a census population last year, and number 5 there, responses to COVID and challenges, and then towards the end there, point number 6, policy areas for Eastern African cities in the age of COVID. Next, please. Yeah, on warning about COVID, I need to say this, that that COVID did arrive in East Africa early in March. Let's continue. Let's go to the next slide. I learned about COVID in much more in January, but I'm a reader of the Economist, and the Economist cover for March, early March, had that prophetic article title that is, it's global. COVID has gone global, and the editorial page did give a big warning to governments that that they have to do a lot of work, because in public health, honesty is worthy a lot more than hope. And there was also a story in the same document that you read closely, and that's where I understood really what COVID was and how to manage it. So that is early, just before COVID came arrived in the country. Next, please. My reaction to pandemic was that my initial reflection was that because this is a human-to-human transmitted disease, unlike earlier, and the close connection between China or Asia and East Africa in terms of trade, I knew very well that it was more of a matter of time before this pandemic comes up there. In any case, the picture that came particularly from Italy and Spain to Africa through the media indicated that it will be a very serious pandemic. But most importantly, given that much of African cities have slums, and East Africa have quite some of large slums, as we shall see shortly, I worried a lot because I knew if this pandemic gets into these slums, it will be a catastrophe. Of course, there are issues of informal employment and livelihoods, and therefore the implications for costs, both in terms of medical science and administration of logistics in delivering what needed to be done, it meant that it would be a lot, and that it had implications, at least in Africa, if not global. Let's continue. Those are the dates on the third column, indicating the dates actually each major countries in Eastern Africa announced the first infections. If you look closer at that table, it's only Southern Sudan that announced the pandemic arrival in April. The rest got it in March. You also note that somewhere for Tanzania along the way, on June 9th, the president announced they are not going to give a statistic, they are not going to monitor, and they questioned they raised so many questions about the disease, and they said, okay, God's power had removed the coronavirus from the country. Let's continue. Next slide. Definitely, that table also indicates generally the spread of the disease as 7th and August. And this is important because this is the month that that Kenya had highest. The peak was higher in the month of August, but now it has flattened, as we shall talk much earlier. As you can see, the region East Africa was about the second last in terms of the percentage COVID cases. Let's continue. On urbanization, a few things we may note. Continue. That in East Africa, we have East Africa community with whose membership is those countries has about 117 million people with urbanization level of 25%. But if you add other countries like Ethiopia with 114, almost 15, and then Somalia, we are saying that the region has about 300, almost 300 million people. Let's continue. Now, when you look at urbanization level in the region, obviously, as it was mentioned earlier, the region is currently the least urbanized, but it has the highest rate of urbanization for both growing urban agglomerations like Kampala, Kigali, Dar es Salaam, Nairobi, and Mombasa, and also other cities like Addis Ababa, Bujumbura, Dar es Salaam, Kampala, Mogadishu, and again Nairobi. So you can see, even though the region has less percentage of urbanization, it has one of the growing rate of urbanization on the continent. Let's continue. Again, generally those figures indicate annual growth rates figures and the absolute figures and the nearest 1 million. And we are saying that the region currently has about 25.7 million people in these major cities. Let's continue. Interestingly, as you will see in the next slide, the region has got a galaxy of border towns and nodal settlements between countries, and this is where transmission of COVID is likely to happen, because there is a lot of informality in these crude border towns. There is a lot of informal trade. There is a lot of course, most of communities there don't even recognize the border. Let's continue. And then when it comes now to context within which interventions has been done, a few things need to be noted in the fact that there are issues of level urbanization. For example, in Kenya, where we have got previously we have 2016 it was roughly 25 to 27%, but it has been confirmed by census last year. It is 27.51, and the growth rate can be shown quite high, 4.2. But interestingly, the phenomenon of urban sprawl and informality, and then slum, these three factors were key in thinking how to deal with COVID, because we knew very well that once this disease permeates into urban population, these two factors will be catalyst to infection and a growing number of infected populations. Let's continue. On slums, I want to indicate, zero in on Nairobi. Nairobi has some of the biggest slums on the continent. There is Kibera slum, estimated at 117,000 people. And of course, there are quite other figures that come in. And then there is Mathare, and then there is Kiambio, and then Mukuru. And what is important for you to note about slums in cities in Africa, even though the name like Mathare, Kibera, Kiambio is mentioned, even international documented, the slums are clusters of smaller villages. And the one that you see, the last one, Mukuru, has got, for example, two major sub-slums, Kwa Jenga and Kwa Ruben. That is Jenga's slum and Ruben's slum. And you can see the figures. Next slide, please. Generally for Nairobi, this is the map of Nairobi city. And the dots give you an impression of the numeracy of various slums in the city. Let's continue. And then we have got also cities like Mombasa, which has got one of the largest slum, Bangladesh slum, with 26,000 people. And you can see it's divided. It has other smaller village slums. It is a composition of 6 other village slums, and those are the names. And then next slide will also show Kisumu City to the western Kenya on Lake Victoria. That's Nyalenda slum. Again with the about 8 sub slums, smaller cluster slums in the major slums. So this is important to note, because the slum process the invasion process, if at all to get into this slum, it will have to also go through the process of getting into these smaller parts of the larger. Let's continue. Now, before COVID came, the Kenya government has been taking what you call slum improvement programs, and those what I have indicated, 6 of them are indicated there, and the costs involved. Mainly these and the objectives and goals are also indicated there. Generally, the focus is to improve conditions of living by providing communal water points, roads so that they can be accessed, and strengthening infrastructure for accessibility. Generally, this is what has been happening, but this has not been able to deal with the question of density, which is much more critical in managing COVID. Let's continue. Now, when the indicators for dangers of our urbanization process and urban population in regard to COVID is housing. And I'm happy this has come from previous speakers. From census last year, you can see levels of home ownership, both in rural areas and nationally and cities. When you have got home ownership, home ownership 21%, for example, in cities, and then you have got 78.7%, it has implications for COVID infection, because when the livelihoods, the employment had to be decimated by COVID, people did not go to work, then it meant these people were exposed in terms of what they have to pay for rent. And this was a very serious problem, as we shall see in our discussion. Let's go to the next slide. Again, also in terms of who provides housing, these statistics are very important because they do indicate, for example, for those who are renting in the rural areas, who are renting in urban areas, it is individuals, not public housing. It is you and me. Maybe you build an extra home house for rental. So there is a lot of individuals building houses for rental for extra income. Let's continue. What you note, the fourth point there is actually county government. So this is an indication of who provides homes for rental. And as I said, it has implication because if you do not have an income, and I think Sheila from real estate would be much better better demonstrate this. If you have to rely on rental housing, and much of it is from individuals, it is most likely they will not give you a rebate. They will not give you a reduction because COVID has come. So this is part of the challenges, that most people had. Let's go on. We are almost done. In terms of responses, generally when COVID came, the responses as follows. Let's go to the next slide. Generally, there was a ban on public gathering. In fact, in Kenya, as the first announcement for COVID was on a Friday, and on a Friday, I think Friday 13th, and the government closed the country on Monday 16th. So when it was announced, schools were closed, universities were closed. It was so abrupt. But what follows is banning of gathering. Curfew was put across the country. We are still under curfew now, but it has relaxed. It starts at 9 o'clock in the evening. Previously, during the pandemic, serious pandemic time, it started at around 6. Then we had the selected closure in particular counties, cities, and even neighborhoods. In Nairobi, we had 2 neighborhoods closed. In Mombasa, we had 1. Then we have issues of social distancing. The obvious one, social distancing. There was food aid, working from home. Like I said much earlier, there is relief, tax relief already. We were given, employers were asked to give tax reliefs. There were tax property and corporate tax reductions, and of course COVID Medicare. But COVID Medicare was at the beginning. When the numbers increased, it was no longer possible, and so the government started the program of home isolation. So you are restricted in your home. Let's continue to the next one. And then this other was suspension of air travel. This is an international one. Closure of education institution, entertainment, even congregational worship, waiver of water, electricity bills. There was also specific laws and the regulations that were put in place. These are some of the measures that were done. And then we go to the next one. At global level in the country, some program, particularly the first program, Kazi Mtaani program was started, about 100 billion by the government. Kazi means work, Mtaani is word for neighborhood. So if the youth are involved in cleaning, in clearing the neighborhood, cleaning those areas, and they will be given some money at the end of the day, it will just reflect in their mobile phones using the M-Pesa platform. Then we have got also another program. This was a multi-sectoral partnership between the government of Kenya and partners. Then we have relief food. There was quite a lot of relief food around, in particular in Kenya, and also Kigali in particular. The government of Rwanda had a major relief food program. Then Uganda initiated a deliberate research program, which I was also involved in trying to find out recovery policies and strategies in post-COVID era. Let's go on. We are almost there. Definitely, these are the challenges, the normal challenges in managing COVID. Perception that COVID was a disease of the rich. This even today is a major one. There is also a perception that COVID was a hoax by politicians to find time to raise money for campaign. This is also very widespread. There are also doubts of methods of testing for COVID. You heard about Tanzania. There was rise of crime, particularly among family members. There was issues of rape, murders. This was serious in families, and this has to do with the restrictions in movement. There was also avoiding to seek health services because people feared they would be affected by COVID. There was stigma, particularly for people. Once you recovered, you had COVID. People feared that people talked about you that you are a potential person to spread. There was also hostility for urban dwellers who visited rural areas. They were not wanted there because they would spread the disease, because this is the disease of the rich in urban areas. There was also lack of food. Food became a major problem because families could not go out. They could not go out to work. And again, this is where the food stamps came in. There was also a widespread non-adherence to COVID, the rules and the restrictions, particularly politicians. And of course, people, particularly in transport. And this was a major problem. Then international disagreement, you might have heard, there was a disagreement between Kenya and Tanzania, and also Tanzania and Uganda and Zambia, because of testing cross-border truck drivers. The method of how to test was a major problem. Then timely delivery of PPEs, and of course the last one, inability to afford cost of equipment. Particular equipment like computers. When we have to work home, students have to do their exams online. It has been stated about Canada, rural Canada. It was also a major problem. It still remains a major problem in Kenya. The last slide on that one, again, Sheila has talked about the businesses. These indices indicate who gained in terms of property, office rents, and who lost. You can see East Africa, Kampala, Kinshasa, and Nairobi, you can compare and you can see there are some cities that were really affected in terms of office space. Let's go on. As we conclude, the policy areas that seem to be coming up for Eastern African would be as follows. The next slide. Yeah, of course, there are issues of institutional organization for city governance. There are issues of city governance that have come up seriously, and these need to be addressed. Then design and urban spatial organization approaches, particularly to deal with issues of informality, slums, and urban sprawl. There are also issues of urban development densities. Those ones are also a repeater. You can see we talked about Kibera and Madara with those kind of densities. These are really very high. Then the fourth policy area is poverty and informal employment. It is clear even from the previous speakers that issues of inequity, poverty, informality, these in East Africa are major. I think, Juan, you mentioned these things when you made your presentation. The principles are the same, and these are some of the things that I think globally they need a serious policy address. Then we go on. The fifth one there is vulnerable population. There is definitely vulnerable population, issues of shelters that we have indicated. There are when you talk about issues of shelter, there are issues of tenure, there are issues of providing services, there are issues of provided amenities, and also urban mobility and accessibility. It has come out there, but in our cities, this was a major problem, particularly accessing the slum areas and informal settlements. And the last one there, which relates also to the first one, is leadership. Apparently, it appears that political leadership, including civic leadership in municipalities, may have to change tack in the way they deal with the issues of informality, inequity, and jobs creation. I think I would like to end there. The last slide there is on Asante means thank you, and Kwaheri means bye in Swahili. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, Asante, Isaac. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have one question that comes from someone in Toronto and asks, has the collaboration between African countries allowed for the reduction in the spread and prevention of COVID? And how do you think African cities should be best developed as one of the fastest, as they are the fastest urbanizing communities around the world? And I would tag on my own question to that as well. And what I would ask is, East Africa has been doing relatively well with the pandemic, while some other parts of the world haven't. And I was going to ask, is there some micro level compliance on the part of people? Like, did people actually change their behavior at the individual level, making it so that there's distancing, they're wearing masks, and they're careful, in the exchanges that take place? So I'm leaving you with those questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. I did not hear the first question, but let me answer your question. Yes, I think from experience and from what I have seen, East Africa, we have done relatively well because, one, as soon as the disease was proclaimed, as soon as the virus landed in our region, there was a total clampdown. As I have seen, after shown, there was curfew, which we are still in curfew. There was lockdown in particular cities, and there was serious restrictions to moving outside. For example, you could not move outside in Nairobi. The major highways were locked up. So that was the first thing. The other one is that, yes, although people talked about the disease of the rich, the disease of people who travel there, in practice, social distance was obeyed seriously. Then there was masking. Wearing a mask was a major. I remember in May, I went to Nairobi to city center, and I could not imagine that everybody had a mask. So I think has been a major adherence to the restrictions and advice, but there has also been personal commitment, because every home, including my house, I live in a less dense. We are talking about properties of quarter an acre, a half an acre properties. But you'll find that every home has got a sanitizing equipment outside there. So any visitor coming to the home has. In my car, I have to carry my sanitizer. So I think there was an adherence. Of course, there was an element of policing power across the region. In Uganda, in particular, Kenya, there was a lot of policing power to enforce the restriction. Of course, there was a few cases, but there was element of policing power. So issues of liberty were sort of suspended for the time being. And the reason was, according to the government, is that until we know what this enemy is, we have to restrict. Can you repeat the first question kindly for me?
The first one had to do collaboration between African countries.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, that was a major problem. There was an attempt. President Kagame is the current chair of the East Africa Community. He asked for meetings, for heads of state meeting. The meetings aborted twice, but even when it happened, for example, the Tanzanian president refused. So there has been no collaboration. I have, for example, indicated testing at the border point. There were a lot of diplomatic problems. There are countries feeling that you are subjecting our citizens to unnecessary tests, and we have done it. The issue of certification, they even now they have not come up with a standard certification. So I would say that there was no collaboration. Each country has been left to do its own style, and somehow, of course, there are a few principles that are similar, but each country has been left to do on its style, and this is very bad for a region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isaac. I have a question for Sheila, and it's from Singapore, and I'll read it. Okay, given that we expect that a fair number of employees may want to work at home or closer to home in future, do you think there could be greater demand for office space or shared office space in commercial centers close to homes in the future? From the planning point of view, should this not be encouraged, as well as there are clear environmental benefits when there is less need to commute downtown? There are savings in transport costs, as well as all-around better work-life balance. And there's a second question as well. If more employees are able to work from home or close to home, do you think that there's a need to make certain changes to structures of our towns and neighborhoods in terms of provision and accessibility to amenities?
So yes, yes, and yes. Yes, yes, and yes. So what I would say is that everything we know historically is changing, right? And so when I showed you the chart that talks about the distribution of work by being in the office or completely distributed, we're all distributed today in different locations because technology has empowered us to work anywhere, anytime. And really it's up to the individual employee to decide how and where they want to work. That's really where the world is pivoting to through this COVID experience. And so for the employee, you've heard it on our conference today, right? Some of us may want to go into the office. Some of us may want to stay home. Some of us are managing childcare, so they might want to run away from home. So there's many different solutions. And so I think it goes to one size does not fit all. But, I do imagine that distribution of work will continue. Here in Toronto, for example, 50% of our offices are in the suburbs, 50% is downtown. That will continue. I think in the municipal planning world, it's ripe for transformation. I think that, historically what would happen is people would say, here is an office building, here is a residential building, here is an industrial building. Whereas now I think that you're going to see much blended communities and many different activities taking place in those communities. So can shopping malls be converted to accommodate offices? Absolutely. You see the Eaton Center downtown Toronto, where, BMO's taking, the old Eaton Center. You've seen that in Waterloo too, where some of the insurance companies have done that. And so I think that we can't be rigid in our approach to real estate, and that all real estate will change. And we have to be open for that change because everything always evolves. And so therefore we can't have these rigid rules in place and be open to transformation, because that's really the pivot and the opportunity with COVID. Be open to transformation and opportunity.
Okay, thank you. I have what will probably be the last question, if I can find it. And it's the last question for any panel member, and it's from the UK. And it's worded as follows. Kate Rayworth talks about the concept of donut economics, where people, communities, places, and cities thrive when they live between the boundaries formed by solid social foundations and ecological limits and the ecological limits of our planet. Does the panel think that COVID-19 generates the opportunity for cities to transition the nature to work and the role of public, private, and voluntary sectors away from a narrow focus on economic growth to a more balanced perspective offered by Rayworth? So I think part of the question is that when we go back to our world after the pandemic, will it be different? Will we try to make something different from what we've done until now?
I certainly hope so. The optimistic in me says that this is the opportunity now, if there ever was one, to look at how we can create more just societies, use green recovery as a tool to help the economy recover in places across the country and around the world. And so I really hope that our leaders in various countries around the world are seeing this as that kind of Schumpeterian moment of creative destruction, where we do away with the old and come up with something truly innovative that helps address a lot of the inequalities that we've all, I think, touched on in our presentations into a new future that has more opportunities.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else want to say something among panel members?
Yes,
Yes,
I would like.
I think urban design of our cities, places where we live, particularly where we have got high densities, we need to explore how we may provide housing, workplaces that are less dense, because we have found that when the dangers of, let's say, pandemic like that has come, the more dense areas have a higher chance of turning into human disaster. The other thing, the last point I want also to indicate, and this comes from the question that was asked from Toronto, is that government, this was an enemy. This was an enemy that was not visible, a global enemy. Unfortunately, and which is also tragic, governments did not collaborate. In East Africa, they did not collaborate. In fact, they had differences. I'm not sure they collaborated in Europe or in North America. So what has this taught us? When the world is faced with a tragedy, a global tragedy, each government works alone, and that was really, perhaps if they had worked differently, the results might have been different. Thank you very much.
Okay, Yuan.
So there was a question specific addressed to my idea of towards one city that links to that first question. I want to answer in two ways. First, I'm asked often what could be the relation between COVID and climate change, and I think that can answer this question as well. And it's the idea that we need to be very conscious of our approach about how to address these large problems. And by this I mean is that we need to be very compassionate about the way we design these policies and be very clear that in the process we don't leave people behind. because we always say this. We say these big crises create great opportunities for those that can access those opportunities. We always leave people behind. And we said, and this is the question was addressed for me, why don't we let something more organic happen? Because when things happen organically, they leave people behind. So we need to be very intentional about the fact that we have these two cities, and that history have told us that they remain two unless we do something about it. Something intentional, not organic, something intentional about it. There is a quote, and I'm going to close with this, that by Plato in the Republic, and in 365 BCE, he said the same. There are two cities, the city of the rich, the city of the poor, and those two cities are at war with each other. This is not new, but we assume it's not a problem. And we think that the way cities have evolved anthropologically and organically is the best way to do it, but it's not, because a large majority is left behind. And that is my last point.
Any other comments on this? Okay, thank you very much for your participation. Thank you very much for your stimulating ideas, for your reflections. And now I will leave it to Dean Jean Andre, to give the closing comments.
Okay, thank you, Pierre. Well, thank you for staying with us. All of our participants appreciate it very much. Just 4 closing comments. We've known this all the way along, but we're reminded again today just how global this is, how it has infiltrated every neighborhood, every community, every country. And this is the first time in a long time that we have been asked to problem solve in short time on something that affects everyone. The second thing I want to say is, when we're looking at things and trying to understand it, our speakers have done a good job at reminding us that we have to dissect the complexities and look at divides. And it doesn't matter whether they're economic or digital or demographic divides. We have to understand it in its complexities. A third thing that I think came through from our speakers was that everything, I think it was Sheila who said this, everything we know is changing. And so we have to look at responses in the context of all these multiple forces. It isn't just one thing that's changing, but all the things that had been changing are continuing. And some of them are veering one way or the other, and some are just accelerating or decelerating. But it's in the context of multiple forces. And the last thing I'll just say is that we all know that we're in this for a while. It's going to be long-standing responses, and that every government, every organization, every business, every household will be engaged in debates about what we should do. And I just encourage you all to be part of those debates. Thank you to our panelists, to all the organizers. Thank you to you who attended. Thanks for being part of Reunion. And I hope you'll stay in touch and stay safe.